Hello everyone, this is the lecture for chapter 22, which is largely concerned with the First World War and its aftermath, but also some concern is paid to how the U.S. essentially becomes a global power and is in any kind of position to involve itself in the First World War, which in actuality has very little to do with America. And so the first thing that we'll look at in this first presentation is how American foreign policy is shaped. Following the Spanish-American War, things begin to drastically change as far as the way America interacts with the rest of the world. They acquired colonies for the first time, and it basically just whet the appetite for capitalists who wanted to be able to exploit foreign markets as well. And so a lot of that drives foreign policy. And so that's the first thing we'll look at in this chapter. And then we'll start to talk about the war before America enters. And then subsequent lectures will deal with the war as America is involved in it, and then its aftermath finally. This chapter will probably be split up into 4 lectures instead of 3 as well, so we can cover all the information in some detail. So let's get started. Following the Spanish-American War, if you can recall back to chapter 20, the U.S. acquired the Philippines, and it was the understanding of Filipino nationals who helped us oust the Spanish that they would be getting their own independent country after this. And so they were understandably upset when in fact what they got was another imperial power in the form of the Americans. If you also recall from chapter 20, there is a Filipino insurrection going on, and America is attempting to suppress that. While we're doing that, though, China is looking increasingly interesting to American corporate interests who are looking for a place to expand their markets. China's 250-year-old empire is beginning to crumble. And as that's happening, a lot of European powers are looking to carve out specific regions that is exclusively theirs for trading or for development. These referred to as spheres of influence. You can see in the picture there some indication of the sort of activity going on. You have Victoria representing England, you have Wilhelm representing Prussia, you have Nicholas II representing Tsarist Russia, and you have a Japanese individual there, probably representing the emperor, whose name escapes me. You can also see Colombia in the background there, kind of hoping to wedge her way into the table with American interests, and a rather alarmed-looking, sort of stereotypical Chinese figure in the back trying to stop everyone. And this is very illustrative because America was hoping to get a place at that table. And so in order to try and further that goal, the Secretary of State, John Hay, issues a proclamation, if you like, urging these European powers to keep their ports open to American trade within their spheres of influence. He gets a sort of non-committal reply from most of them, but announces to the public that his open door policy has been accepted by his sort of European counterparts. The Chinese government further crumbles, which pretty much intensifies the fighting over spheres of influence, and a big part of that is referred to as the Boxer Rebellion. There are certain anti-foreign factions within the Chinese government. One of them is known as the Harmonious Righteous Fists. They get nicknamed the Boxers by American journalists. And they move in June of 1900 and take over the capital of Peking, or modern-day Beijing. Within that capital, you have various foreign embassies, foreign legations, and they're all trapped within their embassies because they've got rebels who are quite literally out for them outside. and a massive international force is mustered to go in and free those foreign legations, and the U.S. contributes a number of troops to that effort as well. The so-called Boxer Rebellion further, like I say, weakens the Chinese government and sends all the European powers scrambling to more permanently establish their spheres of influence. And so John Hay again sends out open door notes urging them to keep the principle of open trade in China. And he also announces that America is determined to preserve China's territorial and administrative integrity. Along with economic expansion in China, you also have a lot of missionary activity in China. And by 1900, there's about 5,000 U.S. missionaries active overseas, not only in China, but also in places like Africa and India. Another large part of American expansionist ideas in this period centers around the idea of a Panama Canal. Traders had long dreamed of a canal that would allow them to easily access the Atlantic or Pacific from either side. The route around South America was extremely dangerous and also extremely time-consuming. And to this end, in 1879, a French company manages to secure permissions from Colombia. Colombia controls Panama, the region of Panama at the time. However, the French company is pretty poorly managed, and yellow fever is a big problem for the project. And so by 1888, the company is bankrupt and they're not able to do anything. They initially offer all of their assets, including the concession from Colombia, to the United States for a grand total of $109 million. In 1902, they lower the price down to $40 million, and at that point, Congress authorizes President Roosevelt to accept the offer. Secretary of State Hay signs an agreement with the Colombian diplomat, which would grant the United States a 99-year lease on the proposed canal route for a down payment of $10 million and an annual fee of $250,000. That's sent off to the Colombian legislature to approve, but they reject it. However, this doesn't stop American ambitions as far as obtaining a canal. They meet up with a former official of the French company, which had failed earlier, a man called Philippe Bernal-Veria, and he basically organizes a revolution in Panama. He writes up a Declaration of Independence and a constitution. The revolution goes off without a hitch, as scheduled, and conveniently, on November 3rd, when it starts, there is a U.S. warship hovering just offshore to ensure its success. Everything happens really quickly after that. Bernal-Veria becomes the first ambassador to the United States. He and John Hay quickly sign treaties of friendship. Bernal-Veria grants the United States a 10-mile wide strip of land across Panama in perpetuity. So instead of a 99-year lease, they get it forever. And all the other terms that were offered initially to Colombia remain the same under the Panama government. And so the U.S. is able to move in and build a canal. The first problem they face is with yellow fever, though. However, that is fairly quickly dealt with when it is discovered that it is mosquitoes breeding in stagnant water that are spreading the virus. And so they institute a drainage project, and that's done away with. Construction begins in 1906, and by 1914, the first ship is able to sail through the canal. But the kind of dodginess of the dealings surrounding the canal, sour relations between the U.S. and Latin America, and Roosevelt's successors don't do much better as far as improving those relations, while Taft is less active in actually moving troops into Latin America or dealing with things that way. He advocates a kind of economic infiltration into Latin American countries, as well as Asian countries, and it's called dollar diplomacy. And that doesn't really make us too many friends either. Another example worth noting as far as Roosevelt's involvement in Latin America, though, revolves around the Dominican Republic. In 1904, there were several European nations threatening to invade the Dominican Republic because they had defaulted on debts owed to those nations. Roosevelt responds by issuing what becomes known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the earlier Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine stated that European nations were not welcome in the Western Hemisphere any longer. In a nutshell, basically, the Roosevelt Corollary adds to that if there is any Latin American nation accused of chronic wrongdoing, then intervention will be done by the United States. No European nation is welcome to intervene in that way either. And he follows through on this promise. He takes over the customs service in the Dominican Republic for 2 years in order to manage its foreign debts. And this sort of thing happens in other places as well. Wilson in Latin America has a slightly different idea than Roosevelt and Taft do. Wilson criticized his Republican predecessors' expansionist policies and pledged that America would never again seek one additional foot of territory by conquest. However, when things got out of hand in Latin America, he was not adverse to sending in American troops. Again, in the Dominican Republic and Haiti, whenever things began to get interesting, Wilson sends in the U.S. Marines. In Haiti, the Constitution is drawn up, supervised by U.S. Marines, and interestingly, the Constitution is overwhelmingly favorable to the United States. It's events in Mexico, though, that describe Wilson's most serious crisis in Latin America. Mexico won its independence from Spain in 1820, and since then, there was a noticeable class divide between a governing elite and a completely impoverished peasantry. In 1911, a group of rebels led by a democratic reformer known as Francisco Madero rose up and ended the 30-year reign of the president, Diaz, who was the defender of the wealthy elite. In 1913, Mexican troops, led by General Victoriano Huerta, rose up and overthrew Madero. Wilson's foreign policy was called moral diplomacy, and he didn't like the idea of a democratically elected, or at least democracy-supportive government being overthrown by a military coup. His response also was focused on protecting about 40,000 U.S. citizens who were settled in Mexico, and also safeguarding U.S. economic interests in Mexico. He refused to recognize Huerta's government and authorized the sale of arms to a competing general who was threatening to overthrow Huerta. He also ordered a blockade of the port of Veracruz in order to keep arms shipments from coming into the country as well. In April 1914, 7,000 U.S. troops occupied Veracruz and battled Huerta's forces, and eventually he was forced to abdicate the presidency, I suppose, in Mexico, and another took his place, the opposing General Carranza. In January of 1916, a bandit in northern Mexico by the name of Pancho Villa began conducting raids into the United States in New Mexico and Texas. Americans were enraged by this and demanded some kind of action, and so Wilson dispatched an expedition of American forces under General John Pershing, who would eventually lead American forces in the First World War. Villa was proved to be very elusive and continued his raids across the border. Wilson ordered a further 150,000 National Guardsmen to the border. Eventually, Villa ended his raids in 1920 when the Mexican government gave him a large land grant and persuaded him to give up his outlaw ways. All of these involvements in Latin America, though, illuminate a basic U.S. foreign policy goal, and that was to achieve global order that would embrace American political values and welcome American business. A lot of it, though, having a sort of paternalistic and racially motivated lean to it, to say the least. The last place we'll look at is, again, in Asia, and this time dealing with Japan, and it kind of goes a long way towards explaining how relations soured between the United States and Japan later. In 1900, Russia occupied the Chinese region of Manchuria, and they began building railroads in that area. This was particularly alarming to the Japanese, who also had designs on Manchuria and Korea, which was just nearby. The two countries, Japan and Russia, eventually went to war in 1904 when Japan instituted a surprise attack. Japan pretty much dominated the entire conflict from the very early stages. And while Roosevelt was pleased to see Russia's expansionist movements blocked, he was also fearful of a Japanese victory, fearing that it might upset the balance of power in Asia. And so, in order to avoid a victory by either side, he invited both of them to a peace conference in New Hampshire. And in September of 1905, they signed a peace treaty. This peace treaty, while favorable to the Japanese, it recognized Japan's rule over Korea and made other territorial concessions to the Japanese by the Russians. The outcome was ultimately a curbing of Japanese expansion, and that became a primary objective for the United States in Asia. This began the sort of downhill slide between U.S. and Japanese relations, and that was accelerated in 1906 when a school board in San Francisco began assigning Asian children to segregated schools. Japan responded angrily, and Roosevelt responded by asking the school board to halt their discriminatory policy. They agreed to do so, but only on a provision which Roosevelt agreed in an informal gentleman's agreement with the Japanese, and that was that the Japanese would halt new immigrants from coming to the United States. This further poisoned U.S.-Japanese relations. So at the same time that you have American newspapers reporting on the Yellow Peril, talking about the influx of Asian immigrants, you have Japanese journalists who are seeing expanded American military power, especially operations taking place in the coast or off the coast of Asia, different Asian countries, and they are reporting on the White Peril as defined by the U.S. And so that pretty much defines relations between Japan and the United States and affects them in the future as well. So I mentioned in class earlier how I like cartoons because they can convey a lot of information in a relatively quick and easy format, and this cartoon is especially indicative of that. And so here you can see the figure on the left with the really large mustache is the Frenchman, Bernard Voria. He's got his suitcase and documents under his arms, and he's lighting the fire of intrigue, which is going to force the egg labeled Columbia to hatch. The chick in it named the Panama Republic. So discussing the sort of engineered revolution in Panama. The chick pops out of the egg holding a lease for the canal, and they're handing that over to Theodore Roosevelt, who is conveniently leaning on his shovel. All of this meant to convey that there were perhaps some dodgy goings-on in the building of the canal, as I've just described earlier. All right, so looking at a little more in depth at what's going on in Europe. So all these European countries are trying to extend their global influence in the same places the U.S. is, in Latin America and Asia. But you've also got, it's pretty much characterized by very intense competition between the different nations, especially the major ones of France, Russia, Germany, and Britain. So in a very short war between 1870 and 1871, an alliance of German states fights France and wins a pretty impressive victory. In the aftermath of that, you have a united Germany, ruled by Kaiser Wilhelm II. A lot of Germans were convinced that Germany lagged behind in the race for empire earlier, and so Berlin decides to pursue the modernization, expansion, and improvement of its military power. Germany and Austria-Hungary, and later Italy, sign a military defense treaty in 1882. France, Great Britain, and Russia sign a similar treaty in 1804 and 1907, respectively. The Ottoman Empire is becoming much weaker, and in the wake of that, you have new independent nations like Romania and Bulgaria and Serbia popping up, and so you have some quarrel over who is in control of those, whether it is one of the large imperial powers or whether they should have any kind of independent self-determination. Patriots in Serbia were sort of dreaming of expanding their boundaries to include Serbs who were living in the neighboring Bosnia-Herzegovina. Russia supported the ambitions of the Serbian patriots. Austro-Hungarian Empire was based in Vienna and annexed Bosnia, which was fairly alarming to Russia and Serbia. And so this is how you get the powder keg that is ultimately ignited by the shot fired at Archduke Franz Ferdinand in June of 1914. All of these alliances then come into play, and you have everybody lining up on either side. Austria declares war on Serbia. Russia declares war on Austria. Austria's ally, Germany, declares war on Russia and France. Great Britain declares war on Germany as a result. And so you have the lines being drawn much the way they were described in the video we watched during class. America's initial aim in the war was to remain neutral in thought as well as in action, as per the words of President Wilson. But neutrality proved to be difficult. Most Americans had some kind of ancestral ties to England. School books tended to stress the English origins of American institutions. We spoke English, like the English did as well. And all of this served to kind of deepen the bond between America and the Allied side, which included the English. The British also put out a lot of propaganda in America, which stressed these ties in order to try and win America over to their side. There were, however, also a lot of German Americans who tended to sympathize with Germany, as did Scandinavian immigrants and Irish immigrants who were sort of hoping for the freedom of Ireland should the British lose in this particular battle. However, most Americans initially supported the commitment to neutrality, regardless of their own personal feelings on the matter. The question becomes, though, if we were so committed to our neutrality, then why did America eventually go to war in 1917? And what exactly changed? Part of this is ideological. Wilson had a vision of a peaceful, democratic, and capitalist world order, which tended to conflict with his neutrality. He believed that this world would be impossible if Germany won, and so the Allied victory would also not ensure this type of world. And the only way to do that was if America was directly involved in the peace process, and we could only be directly involved if we were involved in the war. And so that ideological concept influences the way we handle different issues as they arise. The major issue that we're faced with is the rights of neutral nations as the war unfolds. The British regularly intercepted U.S. merchant ships that were bound for Germany insisting that their cargo might aid Germany's war effort. Americans protested, especially when Britain declared the North Sea a war zone and planted mines and other things, and also blockaded German ports. However, it was Germany rather than England that ultimately pushed the United States into the war. Germany had a new weapon, as you can see in the bottom picture there, and it was a submarine, the U-boats. In 1915, Berlin proclaimed the waters around Great Britain to be a war zone and warned off all ships, saying that the submarines would attack any ship attempting to get into British ports. Wilson responds to this by saying that Germany would be held to strict accountability for any loss of U.S. vessels or lives. All of this comes to a massive head with the incident surrounding the Lusitania. Earlier in May, in fact on May 1st of 1915, an ad went out in U.S. newspapers from the German embassy saying that the Lusitania was a suspected vessel, and if she ran across the U-boat would shoot to sink her. And it warned American travelers off of this ocean liner. Americans tended to disregard this warning, and 6 days later, after that ad went out, a U-boat came across the Lusitania off the coast of Ireland, shot her down, and killed over 1,000 people, including about 128 Americans. Historians later discovered that the Lusitania was, in fact, carrying munitions to England, and so the Germans were perfectly justified in the sense of it being a war to sink her. Wilson demanded that Berlin stop the unrestricted submarine warfare. However, that information that the Lusitanian was carrying arms didn't come out until much later. He also demanded that the Germans pay reparations to the U.S. for the deaths in the sinking. He felt that the United States could persuade the belligerents to recognize the principle of neutral rights without ultimately going to war. But the disaster drove some pretty deep divisions in U.S. public opinion, generally. Americans are becoming much more willing to fight in this war now because you actually have the loss of American lives to contend with. The National Security League was formed, and it was a lobby of bankers and industrialists who promoted stepping up arms production and organizing preparedness parades. And even by 1915, Wilson as well calls for military buildup, suspecting that the U.S. will eventually enter the war. The British play on these fears fairly readily, putting out propaganda, calling the Germans the Huns, and detailing perhaps true, perhaps false atrocities of German soldiers. You have others, though, still that are attempting to remain true to their neutrality, don't want to get into the war. A lot of progressives fall into this group. Divisions even surfaced within Wilson's own administration. William Jennings Bryan, who was serving as Secretary of State, actually resigned because he felt that Wilson's message after the Lusitania was a little too hostile. Early in 1916, some congressmen also seeking to avoid these Lusitania-type crises introduced a bill that would ban Americans from sailing on belligerent ships, but Wilson successfully opposed it. His approach, though, seemed to work. The Germans ordered the U-boats to spare passenger ships and offered compensation for American lives lost in the Lusitania disaster. However, in March of 1916, another U-boat sank a French passenger ship in the English Channel, and American lives were lost once again. Wilson threatened to break all diplomatic relations with Germany, and so they issued a pledge called the Sussex Pledge not to attack merchant vessels without warning, provided that the British also observed the rules of international law. Americans generally ignored that proviso and announced that Germany completely accepted our demands. Meanwhile, American support for the Allies is becoming a lot tighter because the Allies are borrowing copious amounts of money from American banks. J.P. Morgan's bank lent about $500 million to the British and French governments. And by April of 1917, when the U.S. actually enters the war, U.S. banks had lent around $2.3 billion to the Allied cause. The land war in Europe, however, were starting to settle into a very grim stalemate, generally right along the Marne River. Both sides dug in, constructing trenches, pretty much from the English Channel all the way inward to the German border for the most part, or the Swiss border rather. And the line very rarely changed. You would spend hours attempting to gain 10 feet of ground. And so morale was sinking quite quickly for soldiers who were actually fighting. On the home front, the war pretty much dominated the presidential election of 1916. Charles Evans Hughes ran on the Republican side against President Wilson, and he criticized Wilson's lack of aggressiveness while also rebuking him for policies that risked war. However, Wilson managed to win a very narrow victory. He was aided a lot by women voters in Western states who had all adopted suffrage by that point. And the winning campaign slogan for the Democrats was that he kept us out of the war, revealing that there was still quite a lot of popular support for neutrality, even as late as November 1916. In February of 1917, Germany resumes its policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. They acknowledge, at least to themselves, that this will probably force the United States into the war, but they believed that the U-boat campaign would be able to sufficiently hamper Allied war effort before the U.S. could really muster a force and make any kind of dent in the war effort. Everything happens really quickly after that. On February 3rd, Wilson breaks off diplomatic relations with Germany. In February and March, U-boats sink 5 more ships, American ships. A little bit later, a coded telegram from a German foreign secretary called Arthur Zimmermann to Germany's ambassador in Mexico is intercepted by the British. And this is promising Mexico that if they would declare war on the United States in return, then Germany would help restore Mexico's lost territories of Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. Events in Russia also served to create favorable conditions for America's entry into the war. In March of 1917, Russian peasants, industrial workers, and intellectuals, inspired by Western liberal values as well as communist revolutionaries, joined together in order to overthrow the Tsarist government in Russia. A provisional government is set up under a liberal, Alexander Kerensky, and it's believed to be a promise of a democratic future for Russia, and that makes it much easier for Wilson to push his idea of a democratic crusade as far as the war is concerned. Shortly after that, on April 2nd, he calls for Congress to issue a declaration of war. The Senate votes on the war 82-6 in favor. The House agrees 373 to 50. The German violation of U.S. neutrality and America's own ideological commitments and cultural affinities are all responsible for propelling the nation into the war. British propaganda and the preparedness campaign also have some small contribution, at least, to America's entry into the war.